Mm, Hi, I'm presenting on adoption, and this topic was a very broad topic in a lot of ways because adoption has many different forms. There's private adoption and foster care adoption, and in the private sector, there's the international adoptions as well as domestic adoptions, and then foster care is its own system as well. So, what I will attempt to do is define um, what an orphan is, the differences between the different programs, and then an overview of the history and services, interventions, and conclusions. But to start out, the basic definition, according to one of the research articles, is adoption involves the legal transfer of parental rights and responsibilities from a child's birth parents to adults who will raise the child. And that is a definition that spans across any program anywhere in any country, that all the rights of the birth parents would be transferred to a new responsible party. But to start out, this is a quick 6-minute video about children explaining adoption.
My name is Tally and I'm 6.
My name is Hannah and I'm 17 years old.
My name is Kevin and I'm 18 years old.
I got adopted. My mom and dad wanted me.
My favorite animal is an elephant. And this is my brother.
I love sports. I love to play football. I've played football for about 8 or 9 years now. I also love wrestling. Wrestling is my main sport.
My name is Danielle and I am 12 years old.
My name's Amy and I'm 10 years old.
Hi, I'm Mac and I'm 12 years old.
My sister Amy, she's very independent, and she likes to hang out in her room or in the basement and talk to herself.
I'm Jack and I'm 9 years old.
Hi, my name is Leah and I'm 16.
What's your first name?
Nicole.
What's your first name?
Theo. And I'm having Cameron. My name, my Ian, and I own.
Well, I used to think about adoption a lot. I used to wonder where my birth parents were, why, what happened, and why they abandoned me on the side of the road.
I live with my mom, my dad, my brother, my dog, and me.
It's kind of just an explanation for why I don't live with my family. Where I am today is different because of adoption, but I don't let it define me. I'm just a person. I'm just here.
What I like about adoption is that people who can't support a child but want something better for them give their child to somebody who can't have a child but can support them.
What I know is that we got left behind in a street, and then people came and they picked us up and they put us in the orphanage.
My birth mom, she actually keeps in touch with me and stuff, so she sends letters and presents to both of us actually.
I like to play basketball. My dad's the coach, and our team's the Hornets. It was kind of exciting to have a new family, and it was kind of sad because I missed my first mom. My first memory in Hashem came to my basketball game, and I lost it. I have 3 moms. One of my moms is Nicole, and she's my first mom. My other mom is Pam, and she's my foster mom. And the other one is Kathy, and she's my forever mom.
I've developed talents from my mom, and it's not necessarily genetic,
it's more about nurture versus nature.
I've been through a lot through wrestling. It's helped me think about adoption in a way, because I think that if I wasn't adopted, I wouldn't be a wrestler.
My sister Molly is also adopted from Yunnan. We rarely talk about like adoption or things like you would think people talk like one-on-one sentimentally. Like since they're adopted and they have this in common, they have to talk about it. But no, we're sisters, and that's it.
When I came to stay with Theo, Theo started acting really silly. I love you! I love you.
I think adoption is like special for the parents and for the child, because a lot of the children are in like bad living conditions, so it's an opportunity for both the parents and the child to have a better life.
It's absolutely incredible that my dad is so involved with FRC still, brings them to all the galas, and he makes sure that we're involved with what has been such a big part of our lives.
Are we gonna tell someone what adoption was and didn't know what it was? I'd say giving kids a better life in a new home. It's changed my life completely. I used to be lonely all the time.
It means that you get to go to a new family and live with them forever.
I'm not lonely anymore now that I was.
I love you.
I love you too.
Let's have a staring contest.
My birth mom came in contact with me a few years ago, and I had always wondered about my birth family and everything, because I always wanted to like have a connection, kind of like where you look at your mom or something and you can see like, oh, she has your eyes or something. And I always thought that was cool for other people. So it's really nice that my parents allow me and my brother to do that.
I suspected to take my sister's dear ones. I don't know why. I think I was just mad. But then my parents talked to me and the doctor talked to me. and then they put the toothpicks on the high shelf like fine so I can get them. I don't do that anymore. So.
And even though our family is crazy, we still somewhat get along.
Yeah. When people see our family, a lot of times they ask if my sisters are my friends and like if I'm with them. But I just like to remind them that family isn't all about appearances. It's about, I don't know, it's about what makes a family is that you love each other, not because you look like each other.
So that is, I need to pause this. And come back to our presentation. So that's in their own words, and I just think it's great how they articulate adoption and the fact that what makes a family is that they love each other. So one of the terms that's associated with adoptions is orphans. Obviously, if an orphan is someone who's lost both parents, that would be would represent a need for adoption. However, UNICEF and global partners define an orphan as a child under 18 years of age who has lost one or both parents to any cause of death, and 140 million children are classified as orphans. Of those 140 million, 15.1 million have lost both parents. But one thing that I liked in their article on this topic is that they pointed out that the idea could be that means there's 140 million kids, or at least 15.1 million who would need to be adopted. However, that's not necessarily true, but what is needed is support for those who are caring for them. So communities, neighborhoods, family, friends, all of that is part of helping to provide for orphans, and then a portion of that is adoption. But oftentimes, children who need to be adopted, who don't have a forever family or have a family that is available to join either through foster care or other ways, end up in residential care. And so this was an interesting statistics and slide, and I will reference later in the presentation that one of the issues that they're finding that they're having trouble with is the fact that they can't find it's hard to have accurate statistics surrounding this issue. But this is based on residential care in 2.8 million children in the whole world. You can see here in this this part of the slide that those children are in care, and we know just based upon research that children thrive in families, and so it's really important that we raise awareness to this issue, and there has been awareness, and they're trying to, especially in the States, trying to eliminate residential care. However, we need to meet the need with more homes, more families that are willing to take in kids and possibly adopt them. So just in the United States alone, this is looking at from the fiscal year of 2007 to 2016, so a couple years ago, but 57,000, and you can see that number here, 57,200 children were adopted, but there's 118,000, sorry, 218,000 children waiting to be adopted. So, and then parental rights that were terminated were 65,300. So once parental rights are terminated, then children are available for adoption. So this is just one of the basic slides that I found where they are trying to collect more and more statistics and more data on this issue. So this is another video understanding what it's like from the child's perspective. So I will watch that and then I can discuss it.
I was feeling really scared because I didn't know where I was. I don't know what was happening or whatever. And because these people just came to my house and just took me, it was like at night when they took me to this house. And I felt really scared because these were strangers I was living with. I had no idea what was going on.
My mom had fallen. She started doing drugs and alcohol when she pulled us out of school and go to our biological dads. Obviously just do drugs and stuff and not even care about what we were saying and stuff, because she'd do it right in front of us. Living in the group home, I felt like I wasn't respected. I was always mad and angry. My former family put me in the group home, and I thought they didn't love me more. It's my fault that every time I'm in the group home and that I'm not worth anything.
Switch homes like more than 8 homes, just about. And I was getting in a lot of trouble because I was confused and stuff like that.
Well, it's kind of hard because nobody really likes coming from another person outside, just kind of trying to get to know. Then you move out, then you gotta learn, get to know somebody all over again. Like nobody wanted me. Like people will give up. Like if I do one little thing wrong, they'll just send me away to somebody else. I was like, is this the last home I'm going to? And I go to like 3 more homes. Every teenager in foster care always thinks, oh, whenever we get adopted, we're going to stay in foster care until we're 18, because nobody wants teenagers. They want little babies to let them grow up in their home
So we always thought, what's the use of even trying to get adopted?
Because once you get bounced around so many times, you finally like, give up and say it's not going to happen.
So this is the struggle that many of the children feel, and the populations that we are trying to address with these kiddos, and I will try to move this around. But we want to provide forever families because we know that that has the best rate of success as far as setting them up for positive outcomes. But I thought this picture was interesting. 3.3 million reports of violence against children, and then that results in 251,764 placed into the foster care system, promising them a better life, essentially. However, 23,000 of these kids, 23,439 are aging out of the system with no forever family. And 1 in 5 will become homeless after age 18, and then 1 in half will be unemployed by age 24. Less than 3% will earn a college degree, and then 71% of young women will be pregnant by age 21, and 1 in 4 will experience PTSD. So there are a lot of success stories, but this issue has to be addressed, and we have to raise awareness from all different levels, and I'll talk about that later in the presentation, but to find families who will care for these kids. I know that kids aging out at 18, even 21, now that the age limit is extended, I wasn't ready at 21 to become fully independent. So definitely things have to change. But looking at the history of adoption, there is pretty extensive history of adoption practices, reforms. Starting in the 1800s, 1851, the Adoption of Children Act passed the first modern adoption law that recognized adoption as a social welfare issue concerning the interests of children rather than adults. So this is when, right around the time frame that we saw the orphan trains, that part of history comes into play. And so children would ride in on these trains, and they'd be immediately displayed for families in the community to choose a child to join their family. And usually the intent was for them to be able to help on the farms and as laborers, but there was no regulations to make sure that these kids were safe. And then in 1875, the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children began. This was the first organization developed with the sole purpose of protecting children. It was a private organization. And then organized child protection emerged from the rescue of Mary Ellen, which in different topics and in our different studies, we've learned about her and the abuse that she endured. And so that sparked a new movement in history. So moving into the 1900s, by 1922, there were 300 non-governmental child protection societies across the U.S. Still, for most children, help came from family, neighbors, and police who were willing to get involved. So they were still working on organizing it and moving it to more of the government side of protection. So in 1919, development of the first juvenile court took place. So the world's first juvenile court was established in Chicago in 1899. Juvenile courts spread quickly, and by 1919, all states but 3 had juvenile courts. Then in the 1930s to the 1960s, there was just a lot of assessment and development of the different agencies. In 1956, Vincent Day Francis, director of Children's Division of the American Humane Association, conducted a survey of child protection agencies in 1957 and again in 1967, and he concluded no state and no community has developed a child protective service program adequate in size to meet the service needs of all reported cases of child neglect, abuse, and exploitation. So the 1960s to the present child reform was all designed to address those issues. And the first, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was one of the main key legislations that has kind of helped to design what we see today, and then the other different acts that we'll talk about the legislation. But the key to the CAPTA, Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, was centered on funding. So funding for families, funding for the government to be able to provide the services needed to be able to serve all the calls, all the reports that were being made. Then the Adoption and Safe Families Act was a reform of that bill, of the bill of Title 4E, which was a funding program. And so that's it aimed to increase state accountability through requiring documentation of state efforts to transfer children from foster care to permanent placements in adoptive homes as efficiently as possible. So the goal is that children wouldn't have to be moved again and again. They want to, and nor would they be held up in the system waiting for either the rights to be terminated or to reunify. So that was an important piece of legislation. And then the Safe and Timely Interstate Placement of Foster Children Act in 2006, ICPCs. So all of these different legislations are essentially to protect, obviously, to protect children. And what was happening is if a child was transferred across state lines, there was no regulations to, it would be based on state by state and not a whole lot of communication. So some of the children, we couldn't protect them the way that with this legislation there should be more, there's more guidelines and communication between agencies from one county to the next or one state to state. And then the last is the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, and that was requiring all parents or prospective adoptive parents to be background checked, and that exemptions from that would not take place. So everybody would have to be background checked. I know in my field of working in foster care, there's no, everybody, even if you just want to foster, has to go through now adoptive parents. So those are the four main child reform. And then, but issues related to social work, no system is perfect, according to Myers, is perfect, but by far we have come a long way in protecting children. Unfortunately, much of what we hear regarding the failings of the system is regarding the failings of the system as opposed to the successes. So a lot of this, I mean, I've definitely personally seen the failings of our system. However, there is a lot of successes, and that's important to keep in mind, that these acts, these pieces of legislation actually do help to protect our kiddos. So that is a brief history. But in the most current Vulnerable Children and Families Act of 2017, this also touches on intercountry adoptions, but also the whole idea is to make sure that that the United States policy is facilitating appropriate and timely placement of children into permanent families. So I know from my personal experience in California, that looks like preparing all foster families now as resource families, which is really saying that you are prepared to adopt these kids from the beginning. And there's concurrent planning. And the concurrent planning is your plan for adoption and your plan to reunify. And then whatever plan works out based on the timeline that is given by the judge in the county, then that would move the child into a permanent placement as soon as possible. So, but as far as intercountry adoption, since 2004, then it says here on this Vulnerable Children and Families Act of 2017, since 2004, the number of international adoptions into the United States has decreased by 72%. and international adoptions worldwide have decreased by 50%. So this act ensures that international child welfare and efforts to provide permanent and safe homes for vulnerable children are a central part of international diplomacy. So they've changed even the structure. So there was the current Office of Children's Issues, and now it's the Office of Vulnerable Children and Family Security. And this office will build international capacity to implement effective child welfare systems. So with a focus on reunification, kinship care, domestic and inter-country adoptions. So that's important, and it's fairly new, so I'm sure there's going to be a lot to learn and amend as time goes on. But adoption services are really important. The first step is finding a forever home for these children, but there's so much more to the process, especially given the context of their prior background, their trauma, their experience. So even if in private adoption, children adopted from birth, there's still going to be identity issues and things that have to be addressed, such as either if it's an open or closed adoption, foster care adoption, it's trauma-based, things that they've experienced in their early developmental years. And then just addressing, I'll talk about that in the intervention, but just addressing the different challenges to adoption. But the services that are available are really important. And if someone is interested in adopting, you can always contact your public counties, or state agencies, or do it through private agencies. I know in my county, I'm in Ventura County, and we have 4 private agencies, and then the county that both facilitates resource parents or adoptions. And then there's also agencies that have specialized post-adoption services, support groups, things like that, and then community and mental health organizations and service providers. To be more specific, to find resources in your area, there's I would highly recommend the National Council for Adoption, and that's actually where on your left, on this side of the screen, this site, if you go to adoptioncouncil.org/resources/general, this is what you'll see. And so there's books, there's resources, foster care, in global and inter-country adoption, state regulation, state facts, and then adoption statistics. So there's a whole lot of information here. And then, of course, Child Welfare Information Gateway has a ton of topics related to adoption and foster care adoption and just child welfare in general. So those 2 I highly recommend. But again, you can Google and research in your area what is available as far as adoption agencies and county resources. So interventions are really important, obviously, to be able to serve this community and help to raise children who are securely attached, confident in who they are, and hopefully giving back to society. So those 3 things, if we're integrating children into our family biologically, adoptive, foster care adoption, however, whatever that looks like, it's really important to address the issues that children have growing up. So identified 3 different micro-level interventions. They're therapeutic interventions, and 2 of them have a scientific rating of 3, which is the TheraPlay and the didactic developmental psychotherapy. The attachment regulation and competency arc model trauma treatment didn't have a rating. However, I find it to be extremely beneficial with the clients that I work with who've had a trauma background or have had issues in attachment. But first, to start with TheraPlay, structured play with children and their parents. So if children had not learned to try that first, Erik Erikson's first stage of development is to learn trust, that stops the attachment or or disrupts the attachment bond that's supposed to be there in the first developmental years of life. So kids are going to need to have interaction with a primary caregiver that is safe, responsive, and therapy play is a great way to do that. And so as far as what's reported, the goal is to increase the child's sense of felt safety and security, increase child's capacity to regulate affect, increase child's sense of positive body image, ensure that caregivers are able to set clear expectations and limits, ensure that caregivers' leadership is balanced with warmth and support, and increase caregivers' capacity for reflective function, and increase parent and child's experience of shared joy, increase parents' ability to help child with the stressful events. Through the different sessions and the interacting of play and how they interact together, those things are addressed and take place over time. So then the attachments, regulation, and competency model is somewhat similar in the sense that it's a form of therapy that also includes the parents, which they're finding is really important, that most of the work that's done is not necessarily in the hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours that a therapeutic session provides. It's really the skills and tools that are being learned in those sessions and taking them and living those out at home. But the goal is attachment regulation, competency, and it's integrating routines and rhythms and structures into the intervention approaches, and again, felt safety and all of that. The last psychotherapy model is also involving the parents, and is used when a child has had severe neglect or not been able to have their needs met, things that disrupt that secure attachment. So within this model, the foundations of these interventions, both in home and in treatment, must incorporate attitude based on playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. It must never involve coercion, threat, intimidation, and the use of power to force submission. So it's really a form of therapy that teaches parents to interact with a child in a way that fully accepts their expression of their playfulness, just going with them in curiosity and through empathy, that it's not necessarily control. There's definitely ways to correct and reinforce positive behaviors without having to focus on negative behaviors. So that form of therapy is really helpful. As far as the meso level, and I put it on the same slide because part of the problem that they're finding is adoption competent clinicians. And so that is one way that we can look at this from a meso perspective of looking at the community and our coworkers. There was a survey conducted that among 485 of respondents who reported to working with at least one mental health professional, and these respondents were adoptees or adoptive parents, at least one mental professional, but they reported only 25% of them said they were with a clinician that was adoption competent. What that really means is they reported their therapists to being insensitive or lacking in adoption knowledge in areas including attachment, trauma, loss, and the use of appropriate language. So that's definitely an area that is important to address and think and be able to either do more research or more training or offer more courses or classes on this particular topic of adoption, so that as clinicians we can be more familiar with the issues that pertain specifically to adoptees. So then at a macro level, the primary goal to protect the child with a focus on their well-being, the state and federal policymakers must work to make child welfare a priority across jurisdictions, will commission hearings and advocate for research evaluating adoptions. Such reforms should help change how children are treated and monitored within a currently flawed system. And this is from a Bartel article. However, I do have the current legislation, the Reform Act that is moving towards trying to provide permanency and being able to move kids into family home dynamics is really positive. We just have to have a better implementation of that. So finding, maybe it's a recruitment strategy. Maybe it's funding for recruitment, but specific issues that need to be addressed is we need to be able to identify more accurate and available statistics and data. So there seems to be work towards that. And then addressing the challenges to traditional adoption. It is quite an extensive process and a very expensive process. So that could hinder people from who would otherwise be willing to adopt. That could hinder them from actually following through with the process because it tends to be very overwhelming at times, and definitely cost can be an issue. Foster care is just personally in my field, I have seen families come to become foster parents because they want to adopt. I personally don't feel like that's a great plan because the idea is we want to champion reunification, and if your sole purpose is to adopt, that could be a really difficult road because you have to put the foster care hat on first before you put the adoption hat on. So that's just a personal bent on that one. But the third, the enforcement of the Interstate Compact on the Placement of Children, ICPC. So according to this article, that children transferring from state to state, there's still not a lot of awareness and knowledge about, from a government perspective, of the laws and regulations. So things can get missed, and children, we might not be doing our due diligence to make sure that children are being placed in secure and safe homes, safe and loving homes. So those are just a few of the ways in which we can address this from a macro level. The last part, I'm a little bit over my time, is the conclusion. So qualitative research, expanded clinical training opportunities, and clear definition, adoption confident practices will lead to much progress in the next 10 years. So what has been done so far is a lot of the legislation I talked about, what can be done. According to the article by Wiley, issues reported as problems, there's failure to provide accurate information about the child's history, blaming adoptive parents for child's issues, pathologizing adoption, and/or view the family as pathological, questioning parents' motives for adoption and for the particular type of adoption, advising parents not to talk about adoption with children because it will stir things up. Definitely seen that one. And we need to definitely be able to address and combat different misconceptions of reality as far as what actually would stir things up for kiddos and how can we help them walk through that process. So next one was speaking out against open adoption or seeking info on a child's origins. So we need to be able to be better educated about open adoptions and the value of being able to identify the child's family of origin and their history and their culture. The next one was telling parents to turn their children over to the government agencies when problems get too large. So we need to better educate parents on trauma so that when things are difficult, they understand what is possible and what the capacity of a child to grow and heal is when we interact with them in healthy ways. So the last one was working with children individually and without family involvement. History of attachment or trauma may require specialized parenting. So if if we've been working individually with the child as opposed to including it to be a family unit, that's definitely going to be a problem. So that's something that can be done in the future is really advocating for therapeutic solutions that involve the whole unit, family unit. And then I wanted to conclude with what Myers says. The child protection system protects children every hour of the day. Unfortunately, the public seldom hears about child protection successes. And I just really liked that portion of his conclusion is oftentimes we're so focused on what isn't right that we're missing the fact that there is a lot right, that there are children that are being protected and placed into really healthy, loving homes, permanent homes, and but yet we can do more. So thank you for your time, and I hope you learned something.